Nick Caserio was on Texans All Access with John Harris and Mark Vandermeer. Those guys asked some great questions. I thought Caserio did a good job of shedding some light on some of the draft processes. And I'll just play some of my favorite clips here and discuss. First up, I'll play 3 clips of Caserio talking about where they were at 25 and what they were thinking as the trade unfolded. Here's the first one.
We kind of looked at some different scenarios. We were positioned down there at 25. Yeah. There was a couple situations, opportunities where if we could maybe move up, to the top of the draft, not the top of the draft, but move up a little bit, either pick at 25 or move back, and just it's always based on kind of a pool or a pot of players. So once we kind of got down there in 18, 19, 20 range, we were kind of looking at, had a few players that potentially could have factored in. But even before that, there was a couple trade scenarios that were presented to us that we started to mull a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that jives with everything we've heard and that Nick has said and that has been reported, that they were looking to trade up. He says the high teens or 18 or so. Gray Zabel, the offensive guard or center, whatever he ends up playing, was off the board at 18, and the Texans were looking to trade up at that point. Matt Golden was still on the board. Ibuka was still on the board. Donovan Jackson, the guard from Ohio State, was still on the board. So they started calling and listening to calls at that point.
And then when we got to the actual pick 25, there was a few players that were on the board that we would have felt comfortable taking. We had three different trade scenarios that were on the board at that time. They were kind of weighing. And then when we factored everything in, we ultimately decided just moving back to 34 and picking up the couple extra thirds was the right thing to do at the time. So
the trade worked out there. I mean, if you go by the Jimmy Johnson board or various other trade charts, the Texans won that trade. They got the right compensation for moving back. But then this is where it gets interesting. Albert Breer had reported that the Texans were trying to trade back up into the first round and that their target was Josh Connerly, the offensive tackle out of Oregon. Here's what Caserio said, not specifically about Connerly, but about that scenario.
Once we made the move, there was an opportunity or two where if we can get back in maybe in the bottom a little bit and grab a player, great. If it works, if it didn't, no worries. Then we've been prepared to pick really. We felt we were probably going to pick that second pick on Friday at 34, which is the second pick. Cleveland was going to pick first, more than likely, and then we were more than likely going to pick. And then after that, then it was an amalgam of like a lot of different things that could happen.
So 2 things there. One is that they were probably going to pick if they had that 34th pick. They weren't really interested in moving out of it. Casterly had said on Thursday night that there was still one guy on the board that they liked and that they would have been comfortable taking at 25. I think it's fair to say that that's Jaden Higgins. So they felt good about Jaden Higgins that entire time. I think that something he's going to touch on in a couple of these clips is they try to look at things in pools of players without falling in love with one player individually. He's talked about pools of players and bands of players in a lot of previous appearances. The fact that they were trying to move back up for Josh Connerly, or at least they were open to it, if Connerly was indeed the target, that's just what Breer had reported. I'm intrigued by that, in that I guess it's a little bit of validation of my feelings about Josh Connerly, was that I felt he was definitely worthy of a late first round pick. That's where he ended up going. But it's also kind of validation and confirmation of Caserio's feel about not getting too tied to one player. Mark Vandermeer asked him a question about just the hazards or cautioning against falling in love with one player individually.
And not to get emotionally tied to one particular player. You understand the player. You've graded the player. He has a certain role or value for your team, or you think. If you have the opportunity to draft him, great. If you don't, then you just kind of move on to the next thing. And we were doing that really Thursday, Friday, and even into Saturday as well.
Yeah, he follows the time-honored advice of Jay-Z and Big Pimpin'. Just don't fall in love with him. You just love him, leave him, bleep him, because he doesn't bleep and need him. Yeah, Nick doesn't bleep and need him. He's not going to fall in love with him. I think by and large it's interesting in this draft because, all right, they go best player available. Nick gets very offended if you ask him if he goes best player available or for need. And I agree, and they operate in that way, but they also end up selecting 2 wide receivers and an offensive lineman with their first 3 selections in this draft, which were very much the 2 positions of identified need for this team. So I think there's a continuum there, and I think that you can trade around, or maybe if you're splitting hairs, maybe you got a defensive end graded at 6.31, but an offensive lineman graded at 6.30. You just, okay, you don't overthink it or think that you're smarter than you are. If they're basically equal, then go ahead and take the position of need. So I think like everything else, there are gray areas, and you don't want to fall in love with one area. But Caserio, in describing why they traded up to get Woody Marks, which a lot of people felt was a reach, based on however your board looked like, this was an interesting one. This is Caserio on trading up for Woody Marks.
The fourth, we didn't have a fifth. By the time we picked in the 6th round, there's probably a good chance that Woody was not going to be there. So it's trying to figure out, where do we have to go? Are we willing to give up the compensation associated with that? So I would say that was part of the rationale behind the Woody decision.
They liked Woody Marks. They had a lot of real estate between Woody Marks and when they drafted next. So they went ahead, and maybe even in their own minds, that might have been a reach. The other dynamic I think that could be at play here too is Caserio had made a comment before the draft that, hey, our board of players that we like is probably smaller than a lot of other teams. And you're getting to that spot where, man, whether it's Woody Marks or anybody else that's still up there, the number of guys that we really like or feel strong about is dwindling. And maybe even mathematically, they could all be gone before we draft. So him going up to get Woody Marks, I'm cool with. And I think the other part of the Woody Marks dynamic is that I think they'd like to add a receiving element to their running backs. I think they'd like to have a guy that's a third down back, maybe as a younger guy. And in Lincoln Riley's scheme, that's exactly what Woody Marks did. He just had a boatload of touches, and he looks really good doing it. So he doesn't have that incredible breakaway speed or things that might make him a guy that goes in the top 2 rounds. But there was just certain specific parts of his game that really scratch an itch for helping CJ out. I mean, a receiving running back, good tight ends, those are 2 of the non-marquee items that can really help out a young quarterback like CJ Stroud. This is a fun one. How do you settle a disagreement between you and D'Amico on draft day?
Do you settle a disagreement if you have one in the room?
We've had very few, so we usually come to, and if we do, he'll beat my. So we'll probably go with the selection that he covets.
If we do, we'll go with the defensive lineman. Some point along the way, either it's already happened or it will happen. D'Amico Ryans sees a 3 technique on the board, and Nick Caserio thinks it's a reach, and D'Amico says, "Damn it, I need a defensive lineman. Feed me a defensive lineman." Oh, this one really rung true with me. And this is where I was reminded that Nick and I are almost the exact same age. Nick and I are about the same age, and he faces the same challenges that many of both you and I face. He was asked, how has the draft room changed over the years?
So I'd say this is a big thing. We went away from the tags this year on the board begrudgingly. So I was like the last of the Mohicans on that, but we survived. Adapt and adjust. Yeah. So, I mean, I think everything's becoming very digitized and very technologically based.
I don't like it. I like being able to touch something and have it in my brain of what I'm doing physically. I've got 3 monitors here, so I can at least pretend like I've got different sheets of paper as I try to keep things organized in my brain. But the younger folks, they've got a leg up on us in this regard, is that they have no qualms at all about just keeping everything digital, and they feel more comfortable with that. So you got to good job by Nick for adapting and adjusting.